Welcome to the history section.
We begin today with an imperial crisis, one that really redefined the landscape of the entire Mediterranean world.
And the year is 1071. It's a moment that delivers a simultaneous two-front disaster for the Byzantine Empire.
It's often treated as a major watershed moment, and that assessment is quite accurate. The crisis of 1071 wasn't just a military setback.
Yeah.
It was a profound geopolitical shock. It really demonstrated the empire's vulnerability in both the East and the West at the exact same time.
In the East, you have the famous defeat of Romanos IV at the Battle of Manzikert.
Right, and that's the one that's most frequently cited as the primary catalyst.
Mm-hmm.
The battle results in the loss of a huge part of the Byzantine field army. And maybe more critically, it begins this process of hemorrhaging control over Asia Minor.
Which was the empire's deepest wellspring of manpower, of soldiers, of revenue. It was everything.
It was the heartland. But the real strategic nightmare, the full context, comes from the simultaneous loss in the West.
And that tends to get overshadowed by the drama of Manzikert.
It does. But in that same year, 1071, Robert Guiscard and his Normans completed their conquest of the last Byzantine strongholds in Italy.
Culminating in the fall of Bari.
Exactly. So the Empire of Constantinople is suddenly, well, compressed. It's geographically reduced to its core.
You can almost picture it on a map being squeezed.
Yes, it's pushed back, lying up against the Black Sea, and it's caught between two incredibly dynamic and hostile forces. You have the expanding Seljuk Turkish power in the east.
And in the West, the increasingly centralized and expansionist Western kingdoms, specifically the Normans, who now control Italy.
So this was a crisis of geographic compression just as much as it was a failure of military policy.
The successor to this increasingly untenable position was the senior emperor, Michael VII.
And this was a man who, history tells us, was profoundly ill-suited to the demands of a collapsing empire.
How so?
He's characterized primarily as bookish, self-absorbed, a man of letters, really, not a man of action.
We have two key historical accounts of him, and they paint very different pictures.
They do, and they capture this tension perfectly. His own tutor, the famous historian Michael Psellus, gave a very approving account.
Right.
Psellus praised the emperor's intellectual focus. He noted that, and I quote, "Nothing pleased him more than reading books."
For Psellus, that was the highest virtue an emperor could have.
But then you get the contrasting view from the chronicler John Skylitz's.
Who is much less impressed.
Much less. He basically scoffed at the emperor's priorities in the face of this external collapse.
He writes that Michael VII wasted energy on the useless pursuit of eloquence and the composition of iambic and anapatestic verse.
And he adds a little aside, and they were very poor efforts indeed, which just shows the contempt. Skylitz's directly attributes the empire's ruin to this neglect.
And this contrast really encapsulates the central problem for Byzantium at this moment.
It does, in a period that demanded ruthless, vigorous, decisive leadership, the kind needed to restore the borders they just lost in 1071.
The emperor was preoccupied with his personal literary efforts.
Exactly. And this imperial vacuum, it just created fertile ground for internal instability. That became the next threat almost immediately.
It translated very quickly into internal strife. Just 3 years after Manzikert in 1074, Michael VII faced a major rebellion.
Led by his own uncle, John Ducas.
Right. And the empire's traditional army was already weakened, already preoccupied with the Turks. It was sparse,
which necessitated an extraordinary and ultimately self-destructive foreign policy decision.
To put down the rebellion, Michael VII's general, a man named Alexius Comnenus, was forced to augment his few loyal troops.
And he did this by hiring soldiers from the Seljuk Turks, the very people who were conquering the eastern provinces.
It's a staggering choice.
This transaction was more than just a military necessity. It forced Byzantium into this dangerous treaty arrangement with the Turks. It set a precedent.
It invited them deeper into the imperial sphere.
And it granted them legitimacy and, detailed knowledge of the empire's internal weaknesses right at the moment when their own power was expanding.
And while Byzantium is dealing with this chaos, the Seljuk leadership itself was going through a succession.
A tumultuous one, yes, but ultimately a successful one that allowed them to expand even further.
In 1073, the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan was assassinated.
Murdered by a prisoner he was interrogating. This left a sudden power vacuum, and succession passed to his son, Malik Shah,
who was only 18 years old.
An 18-year-old sultan. And that sudden change immediately presented the Sultanate with severe challenges on multiple fronts. It threatened to fracture their new empire.
Malik Shah was facing major threats from day one. To the east, you have the Ghaznavids pressing his borders.
To the west, the Sultan of Rum, a man named Kili Arslan, was already chafing for independence. He saw the new sultan's youth as an opportunity.
And to the south, there was the revival of Fatimid power in Cairo.
So this confluence of threats required Malik Shah to fight hard, and immediately just to hold the Sultanate together.
And for the most part, he was successful.
Very. He managed to force the Sultanate of Rum into temporary submission and reinforce the Ghaznavid border. But the most significant move, particularly for what comes later, was his push southward.
Under the general Aziz ibn Abak.
Right. And this move targeted the weakened Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt.
It's important to understand the Fatimid context here. They were a rival Shiite caliphate in Cairo, holding territory up into the Levant.
But their power had been severely compromised. There was a devastating 6-year famine combined with just profound mismanagement.
To the point that a general, Badr al-Jamali, had to establish a military dictatorship in the caliph's name.
Which just shows the political fragility. So Malik Shah, the Sunni Seljuk leader, he viewed the weakened Shiite Fatimids as a target, both politically and religiously.
And Aziz ibn Abak pushed his army south, all the way to Jerusalem.
Which the Fatimids still held. Aziz laid siege to the city, forcing the defenders to surrender in 1073.
But that wasn't the end of the resistance.
No. Fatimid resistance, supported by local people, continued inside Jerusalem until 1077. Aziz grew more and more frustrated with this.
The research tells us that he ordered a brutal massacre of 3,000 inhabitants.
Mostly Fatimid Arabs and Jews.
Yeah.
And that finally ended the Fatimid attempts to hold the city. Jerusalem fell firmly under Malik Shah's control.
Which establishes a key point for later. When the Crusaders arrive, they are not displacing Byzantine power in Jerusalem.
No. They are facing Seljuk Turkish power that had conquered the city from the Fatimids just a couple of decades earlier.
So by the late 1070s, Turkish power is consolidated across Asia Minor and down to Jerusalem, while Byzantine instability just continues.
Which brings us back to Constantinople, where Michael VII's weakness fostered the next round of successful coups.
The army in Asia Minor, witnessing the escalating losses, proclaimed their general, Nikephoros Botaniates, as emperor in Nicaea.
And Michael VII, unable to muster any support, followed the now-established path of abdication. He entered a monastery.
Nikephoros Botanius arrived in the capital, was crowned Nikephoros III, and immediately secured his position by marrying Michael's abandoned wife, Maria.
But the political fallout from this was devastating, especially regarding the previous administration's foreign policy.
You mean the deal with the Normans?
Exactly. Before his abdication, Michael VII had promised his 4-year-old son, Constantine, in marriage to the daughter of Robert Guiscard.
Robert the Fox. A desperate attempt to create an alliance, or at least deter the Normans.
And Nikephoros III broke this betrothal immediately. Against his new wife's wishes, he effectively disinherited her son.
This action had huge negative consequences.
2 specifically. First, it enraged Robert Guiscard, giving him the perfect pretext for the invasion he always wanted.
And second, it alienated the Empress Maria,
who now sought a champion for her son's rights.
And she appealed directly to the most powerful man left in the empire, the general Alexius Comnenus.
The same man who had put down the Ducas Rebellion. He was a highly accomplished soldier, only 30 years old.
Nikephoros III, who was decades older, had expected Alexius's support.
But instead, Alexius accepted Maria's invitation and marched toward Constantinople. He saw his opportunity.
And Nikephoros III, demonstrating the established precedent, abdicated and retreated to a monastery before Alexius even entered the city in 1081.
Alexius was crowned emperor, and Nikephoros III died peacefully of old age in his monastery bed less than a year later.
A quiet end to a very tumultuous reign.
Once in power, Alexius Comnenus moved immediately to secure his dynasty.
He kept faith with Maria at first. He restored her son Constantine's position as co-emperor,
which gave him immediate internal political capital. But he fundamentally shifted the alliances concerning the Normans.
He permanently broke the betrothal. He just ignored Guiscard's threats.
And crucially, instead of allowing Constantine to marry a Norman princess, Alexius engaged his own young daughter, Anna, to the boy.
Anna Comnena, who would later become his biographer.
The very same. This move was a brilliant political maneuver. It ensured the succession would remain firmly within the Comnenus family.
But it also meant that war with the Normans was now completely unavoidable.
The broken betrothal instantly sparked a 2-year war. This wasn't a mere border skirmish. It was an existential threat led by one of the most feared commanders of the age.
Anna Comnena described her father's enemy, Guiscard, with a certain analytical flair. She wrote it was the love of power that inspired Robert and never let him rest.
She noted his boundless ambition. He wanted to annex all of Byzantium to his new Norman Empire.
And his invasion was sophisticated. It combined military might with a kind of political theater.
He arrived at the Byzantine border, accompanied by a monk claiming to be the deposed Emperor Michael VII.
The pseudo-Michael.
The pseudo-Michael, yes. While Constantinople widely believed him to be an impostor, Guiscard used him to destabilize the region and provide a public pretext for what was, in reality, a war of conquest.
Alexius Comnenus recognized the severity of his position immediately. He was caught in a trap.
The situation was summarized very succinctly in the sources. The east was being horribly ravaged by the Turks. The west was in a bad condition, while Robert strained every nerve to put on the throne the pseudo-Michael.
It was an unsustainable two-front war. The Norman army was superior and pushing steadily into his territory, while Malik Shah threatened invasion from the other side.
Caught between the hammer of the Turks and the anvil of the Normans, Alexius realized his new regime could not survive fighting both at once.
He desperately needed to divert Guiscard away from the west, force him to return home to defend his base in Italy.
And for this, Alexius turned to the most powerful man in Western Europe who was also, very conveniently, the papacy's most potent enemy, Henry IV of Germany.
Henry IV had been embroiled in his own civil war for years. He spent the period between 1077 and 1081 putting down a severe revolt in Saxony.
Championed by the Duke of Swabia, Rudolf, who had been declared a rival king.
And crucially, this German struggle had become deeply intertwined with the struggle over the authority of the papacy, the investiture contest.
And the contest of the investiture contest is vital here. Pope Gregory VII had been locked in a bitter struggle with Henry over who had the ultimate authority to appoint high church officials.
Gregory had initially declared neutrality in the German Civil War.
But by 1080, he shifted his position decisively. He concluded that Rudolf would be a better German king.
Meaning, a king more likely to yield control of the church to the pope.
Exactly. This political calculation led to a dramatic escalation. In 1080, Gregory VII once again excommunicated Henry IV.
And he publicly announced that Rudolf, the rival king, was the rightful ruler of Germany.
This was an unambiguous, aggressive political intervention by the papacy into the internal affairs of the Holy Roman Empire.
And this blatant political nature of the decision created a powerful backlash.
It did. It alienated many German bishops, even some who had previously supported the Pope. They saw it as an overreach. A number of Italian bishops also rejected the excommunication as unlawful.
So Henry IV responded with equal force. In May 1080, he called his own synod.
And his loyal German and Italian bishops declared Gregory VII deposed. They elected the Italian Archbishop Wibert of Ravenna as the new rival pope and antipope.
Which solidified the schism and set the stage for a march on Rome.
But first, Henry had to secure his northern border. His army was actually defeated in Saxony on October 14, 1080, but his rival Rudolf was severely wounded.
He lost his right hand, a wound often interpreted as a divine judgment against a usurper.
And he died 2 days later. The revolt collapsed, which cleared Henry's path to Italy and at the same time opened the door to Alexius Comnenus.
With the German Civil War settled, Alexius sent messengers to Henry IV, requesting a swift invasion of Italy.
The goal was purely tactical. Force Guiscard to return home and defend his own territory.
The incentive offered by Alexius was staggering. The massive sum of 360,000 gold pieces.
A vast fortune. Alexius tried to minimize his desperation in the diplomatic message, stating casually, "Although in other respects my affairs go well, to a very small degree they are in disarray."
Because of the actions of Robert?
But the price tag made the true desperation obvious, and Henry IV accepted. That massive payment essentially funded his entire Italian campaign. He crossed into Italy in March 1081.
And this Byzantine-German action, paid for in gold, immediately diverted the course of Western history.
It provided the first real relief to Alexius's forces. Between 1081 and 1082, Henry IV attacked Rome 3 times.
And Pope Gregory VII appealed desperately to Robert Guiscard, his Norman vassal, who remained completely unwilling to abandon his profitable Byzantine invasion.
A critical miscalculation for the Pope. In Guiscard's absence, Henry IV finally breached Rome's defenses in June 1083.
Gregory walled himself up in the Castel San Angelo fortress.
For nearly a year, Henry skillfully consolidated his position in Rome, not through force, but through diplomacy and money. He used that Byzantine gold to win over Gregory's supporters.
By March 1084, the strategy had paid off. Henry convinced Roman priests to support deposing Gregory.
On Palm Sunday, Wibert, the anti-pope, was proclaimed the new legitimate pope. A week later, on Easter Sunday, Wibert crowned Henry IV as Holy Roman Emperor.
A political and personal culmination of nearly 20 years of struggle for Henry.
And the irony is profound. The Holy Roman Emperor, the chief opponent of papal authority, achieved his lifetime goal, thanks, in large part, to gold from the Eastern Roman Emperor.
The political landscape shifted immediately. Guiscard, hearing of Henry's success, finally and reluctantly abandoned his Byzantine campaign.
He left his son Bohemond in charge of the dwindling Norman forces in Greece and returned to Italy.
But Henry IV chose not to engage Guiscard directly. He'd achieved his goal. He and Wibert left Rome just 3 days before Guiscard's arrival.
Guiscard marched into Rome as a supposed deliverer for Gregory, but was met with immediate, violent rebellion.
He was forced to savagely put down the rebellion, resorting to widespread looting. This made him so hated that he had to retreat, taking Gregory with him into exile.
Gregory VII never returned to Rome. He died in exile in 1085.
And on his deathbed, we are told, he absolved everyone he had excommunicated, except Henry, the so-called king, and the Archbishop of Ravenna.
The feud lasted until his last breath. Robert Guiscard, meanwhile, died 2 months later from a fever at the age of 70.
Just as he was preparing to sail back to Byzantium.
His death meant the immediate and decisive end of the serious Norman threat to Byzantium's western borders. Alexius could finally pivot his attention east.
But the legacy of Guiscard's ambition endured for centuries. Dante, writing 200 years later, placed him in the sphere of Mars alongside other great commanders.
A testament to the profound, terror-inducing reputation the Normans established during this brief, brutal conflict.
So with the Norman threat neutralized by 1085, Alexius Comnenus was free to focus entirely on the Seljuk Turks.
Unfortunately, the threat remained persistent. Malik Shah's armies continued to push west, conquering key points like Antioch, removing it from Byzantine control.
And this military expansion was intertwined with a profound religious shift. As the Turks expanded, they were completing their adoption of Islam.
And in the final years of his reign, Malik Shah converted to the Shiite branch, completing the process of making the Turks a Muslim people.
But this broad, unified Seljuk alliance faced a monumental crisis in 1092 with Malik Shah's death.
A catastrophic turning point for them. He left behind 4 sons and an ambitious brother who immediately began a fierce fight over his domain.
Which led to the rapid fracturing of the Seljuk Sultanate.
The unity that had been so threatening dissolved. The Sultanate of Rum, closest to Constantinople, broke free under Kilij Arslan.
And at the same time, regions like Syria, Persia, and Khorasan all declared themselves sovereign Turkish realms.
Alexius Comnenus, the master strategist, immediately recognized this as a prime opportunity. The unified force had become a series of bickering independent states.
And he calculated that with external help, he could recover the lost lands in Asia Minor.
So he sent a message west, seeking help once again. Similar to his appeal to Henry IV, but in a very different geopolitical context.
The climate in the West had shifted significantly. Henry IV, though still emperor, was facing difficulties. The Lombards of northern Italy had rebelled.
And his declining power severely weakened his chosen anti-pope, Wibert. A new rival pope, Urban II, had been elevated in Rome in 1088.
The power balance was swinging back toward the papacy.
Since Henry IV was too preoccupied to help, and Wibert had lost his political effectiveness, Alexius sent envoys directly to the ascending power, Urban II.
And the request was relatively simple. It was utilitarian. Alexius needed Italian soldiers, mercenaries, to help push back the Turks.
Pope Urban II was not just sitting in Rome. He was on a tour through Italy and Western Francia, strategically aiming to demonstrate that the Pope's authority once again covered all of the Christian world.
He seized Alexius's simple request for mercenaries and transformed it into something exponentially grander.
It was the perfect, divinely sanctioned opportunity to reestablish papal authority, not just over Europe, but over the entire Christian world.
This profound transformation occurred in November 1095 at the Council of Clermont in Western Francia.
Urban II announced that the time had come not only to aid Byzantium, which was Alexius' actual request, but to elevate the mission.
To recapture Jerusalem from the hands of the Muslims, a goal Alexius had never mentioned.
The Frankish chronicler Fulcher of Chartres recorded the call to arms. Urban spoke of how the Turks and Arabs had occupied Christian lands, killed and captured many, devastated the Eastern Empire.
And the Pope, speaking with the authority of God, commanded all people, of whatever rank,
Foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly and destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends.
And this is where the genius of Urban's transformation lies. He refocused the aggressive energy of the Western nobility.
He commanded those who had been accustomed unjustly to wage private warfare against the faithful now go against the infidels. Robbers were to become knights.
And those fighting their Christian brothers were told to redirect their aggression against the barbarians.
But the real engine driving this was the ultimate incentive, the promise of divine reward. Urban offered immediate spiritual absolution.
He promised, all who die, by the way, whether by land or by sea or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins.
This declaration was a profound assertion of papal power. It formally reasserted the authority of St. Peter's heir over both the earthly world and, crucially, the afterlife.
And this promise, equating a military expedition with a penitential act, was the spiritual mechanism that set the First Crusade in motion.
With the promise of salvation and a chance for immense temporal renown, the aristocracy of Western Europe began their preparations in late 1095 and early 1096.
The leaders who answered represented the highest echelons of the nobility. Anna Comnena recorded the first to sell his land was Godfrey, Duke of Lower Lorraine.
She described him as a very rich man, extremely proud of his noble birth, his own courage, and the glory of his family. Pride and wealth were as much a motivation as piety.
He was accompanied by his brothers Baldwin and Eustace.
Other leaders included Robert Guiscard's son, Beaumont, the powerful Frankish Duke Raymond of Toulouse, who brought 10,000 men, and Robert, Duke of Normandy, the older son of William the Conqueror.
But these disciplined aristocratic forces were not the first to arrive at Constantinople. The first groups were much more disorganized.
Driven by immediate religious impulse rather than strategic planning. The first leader of note was Walter the Penniless, a Frankish nobleman too poor to hire a large army.
And his expedition got off to a disastrous start in early summer 1096. As his unpaid, starving force traveled through Bulgaria, his men began looting.
The Bulgarians retaliated violently, driving some of the robbers into a church and setting it on fire.
Walter eventually arrived at Constantinople in mid-July. The next large contingent was led by the cleric nicknamed Peter the Little, whose army was later called the People's Crusade.
It had soldiers, but it lacked high-profile aristocratic leadership.
Peter the Little and his troops arrived around August 1st, 1096. Alexius welcomed them, but he quickly recognized the danger of having thousands of restless, armed men outside his capital.
So he suggested they cross the Bosphorus Strait and camp near the Byzantine frontier to await the main armies.
A decision that, though intended to prevent chaos, proved strategically disastrous.
Lacking experienced leadership, the combined forces of Walter and Peter grew aggressive. They began raiding the Turkish countryside and eventually marched directly for the Turkish-held city of Nicaea.
Kilij Arslan, the Sultan of Rum, simply sent a detachment of his army to counter this disorganized mob.
The massacre that followed was a grim lesson. William of Tyre recorded the shocking scale. Of the 25,000 foot soldiers and 500 knights, there remained scarcely one who escaped either death or capture.
Walter the Penniless was killed. The People's Crusade was annihilated.
Peter the Little barely escaped and begged Alexius for help. At this point, Alexius must have been deeply concerned about the nature of the assistance he had summoned.
The subsequent arrival of the disciplined armies of Beaumont and Raymond was a relief, but the emperor had seen the Crusaders' headstrong mindset.
He took a crucial, legally binding precaution.
He secured a formal oath from each duke. It specified that whatever cities, countries, or forts he might in future subdue, which had in the first place belonged to the Roman Empire, he would hand over to the emperor.
This was Alexius's way of ensuring the campaign was fought for the recovery of Byzantium's territories, not for the creation of new feudal kingdoms.
An oath that was immediately resented by the independent-minded dukes.
In the spring of 1097, the united Crusader forces finally crossed into the Sultanate of Rum. They laid siege to Nicaea in mid-May and forced its surrender by the end of June.
The Crusader army, accompanied by Byzantine troops, then marched south. Their initial success was remarkable.
Turkish-held cities that had once been Byzantine strongholds fell one at a time. Smyrna, Ephesus, Philadelphia, Sardis. The campaign seemed to be going exactly to Alexius's plan.
But the string of victories halted abruptly at Antioch.
Strategically, the strongest city in Syria, a massive urban center with formidable ancient defenses. The siege began on October 21st, 1097.
Antioch's walls reached the Orontes River, which gave the defenders a constant supply of water and an easy route to resupply food and arms.
One of the Crusader commanders, Stephen of Blois, wrote to his wife that the city was very extensive, fortified with incredible strength, and almost impregnable.
So the siege dragged on through the harsh winter months. The logistics of feeding the army became impossible.
By December, the surrounding countryside was stripped bare. Provisions dwindled. Horses, which had numbered 70,000, were dying off. By January, fewer than 2,000 remained.
William of Tyre documented the sheer misery. Day by day, the famine grew. Tents rotted away in the continuous rain and cold.
Pestilence broke out. The demoralization was profound. Peter the Little deserted again, but was hauled back and forced to swear to remain.
Meanwhile, inside the city, things were much better. The Syrian chronicler Ibn al-Qalanisi remarked that necessities were actually cheaper inside the besieged city than outside in the Crusader camp.
The leadership also began to fracture. In February 1098, the Byzantine general Tatius removed his men and retreated, likely due to rumors of an approaching Muslim relief army.
And some Crusader leaders were prioritizing personal ambition. Godfrey's younger brother, Baldwin, had veered off to Edessa and established the independent county of Edessa.
A direct violation of the spirit of the oath to Alexius. Stephen of Blois also abandoned the siege, citing ill health.
The outlook finally improved on March 4th, 1098, with the arrival of a supply fleet commanded by Edgar Atheling.
Critically, Emperor Alexius had ordered the fleet to load vital siege materials and tools at Constantinople for delivery to Antioch.
Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond brought the materials back. This allowed the Crusaders to build fortifications that finally blocked the river supply route.
And with the defenders losing heart, Bohemond, described by Alexius Comnenus as a habitual rogue, managed the key breakthrough. He bribed a Turkish guard inside the city.
On the night of June 2nd, Bohemond's informant opened a postern gate. Bohemond led his men in, killed the guards at the gate of the bridge, and opened it for the rest of the army.
The psychological pressure of the 7-month siege erupted into a horrific massacre. William of Tyre stated the victors spared neither sex nor condition. More than 10,000 citizens were slain.
Yet the situation immediately swung back. Just 3 days after the city fell, an enormous Muslim relief army commanded by the Turkish general Kerboga arrived.
The Crusaders were now trapped inside Antioch. The conditions became even worse than they had been outside. The city was stripped of food and stinking with corpses.
To rally the demoralized army, Bohemond announced a divine message delivered through a peasant named Peter Bartholomew.
Peter Bartholomew claimed that the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ, was buried inside the city.
Bishop Adhemar, the Pope's representative, immediately dismissed the story as nothing but words. But Raymond of Toulouse, a devout man, agreed to investigate.
They dug a pit in the Church of St. Peter. It was empty. As Raymond left, dejected, Peter Bartholomew leaped back into the pit and climbed out, clutching the point of a spear.
Raymond embraced the discovery as genuine. Bishop Adhemar chose to hold his tongue, recognizing the need to boost morale.
And it worked. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders charged out of Antioch with the Holy Lance and drove Kerboga's army into a decisive retreat.
Despite the victory, Antioch was never handed over to Emperor Alexius, a clear violation of the oath.
Bohemond claimed that since he personally arranged the surrender, the city surrendered to him, not to Alexius. He intended to stay in Antioch as its prince.
Following the example of Baldwin in Edessa,
Raymond of Toulouse sharply disagreed with this betrayal. He ultimately separated himself from the decision and left the city.
Godfrey and his men eventually followed Raymond, leaving Bohemond firmly entrenched in Antioch, flying his own flag. The Principality of Antioch was born.
The remaining Crusaders, now led by Raymond, marched toward the final objective, Jerusalem. The attrition rate had been staggering. Of over 50,000 men, fewer than 14,000 remained.
On the way, the leading noblemen demanded that Peter Bartholomew prove his claim about the Holy Lance. They were wary of being manipulated again.
He underwent an ordeal by fire, walking through the flames with the spear. He was dreadfully burned and died after 12 agonizing days.
And after his death, the Holy Lance story quietly faded away.
The army arrived at Jerusalem in early June of 1099. The landscape was forbidding. The Turks had stopped up springs and fouled wells and leveled all nearby sources of timber.
For 3 weeks, the Crusaders battered the walls with ineffective siege machines built from twigs.
The turning point came with the arrival of a fresh detachment by sea. Raymond directed that their ships be hauled aground and broken up for their wood.
Siege towers, built from these robust timbers, were finally rolled toward the walls. The northern moat was filled in, allowing the towers to be pushed right up against the ramparts.
William of Tyre explained the final strategy. Fighters set fire to sacks of straw and cotton. The north wind fanned the smoke, which was so dense that defenders were bewildered and dazed.
Attackers lowered wooden bridges and stormed across the walls.
Antioch took 7 months to conquer. Jerusalem fell in barely 30 days. A terrible massacre followed. William of Tyre described a terrible shedding of blood that even the victors experienced sensations of horror and loathing.
The motivation was twofold. Partly an explosion of nearly 2 years of pent-up frustration, and partly a calculated military strategy to wipe out opposition.
News had reached them that a Fatimid army was launching an attack from Egypt to retake the city.
By the time the Fatimids arrived on August 12, 1099, the city was completely under Crusader control. Godfrey led the army out and drove the Egyptians back without too much difficulty.
The core goal was accomplished. Jerusalem had been taken. 3 independent Christian states now dotted the Muslim East: Edessa, Antioch, and now Jerusalem.
The selection of Jerusalem's ruler presented a final complication. Unlike Antioch, Jerusalem had not been a Byzantine city, so there was no obligation to return it to Alexius.
Raymond of Toulouse was the obvious choice to rule. Yet he declined the title of king, perhaps due to the poor taste left by the slaughter.
He was not particularly popular, and the second offer never came.
Godfrey of Bouillon was offered the position instead. He accepted the role, but ruled not as a king, but as Jerusalem's duke and protector.
The First Crusade, initiated by a desperate plea for mercenaries, concluded with the establishment of Latin states, a betrayal of Alexius Comnenus' goals, and the permanent insertion of Western European military power into the Middle East. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.